Trillions of dollars vanished overnight. Entire economies trembled. Markets plunged into chaos. All because of one man's decision. Well, on April 2nd, President Donald Trump announced sweeping new tariffs, which include 10% on every import to the United States, and much higher for countries he believes have cheated America for decades. Within 48 hours, global markets collapsed in ways we haven't seen since the COVID-19 crash. The FTSE 100 had its worst fall since COVID-19. The S&P and Nasdaq spiraled, and economists whispered two words we haven't heard in years: global recession. In this video, we're going deep, chapter by chapter, to uncover how one announcement might have reshaped the future of the world economy. Buckle up, this is the Tariff Tsunami. Liberation Day, the announcement that changed everything. It began like any other spring morning until it wasn't. On April 2nd, President Donald Trump stepped behind a podium and declared what he called Liberation Day. But this wasn't about military conflict. It was about trade, and the weapons were tariffs, bold, sweeping, and designed to reshape the global economy. In his statement that shocked both allies and adversaries, Trump announced a universal 10% tariff on every single import into the United States. From German-engineered cars to Vietnamese coffee beans, no product was spared. But the real jolt came from what followed next. Trump then outlined even steeper tariffs for specific countries he accused of exploiting U.S. generosity for decades. China, the biggest target of his ire, would now face an unprecedented 54% total import tax. Vietnam wasn't far behind at 46%, with Cambodia hit at 49%, and even long-standing allies in the European Union slapped with a 20% tariff. It wasn't just a trade policy, it was a statement of intent, a realignment of how America would interact with the world. The timeline? Immediate. The blanket 10% tariff was scheduled to roll out April 5th, with the harsher country-specific rates kicking in just 4 days later, on April 9th. No delay, no debate, no multilateral negotiation. This was a unilateral reset. From the podium, Trump painted the move as a bold reclamation of American strength. He called it a necessary correction to decades of what he described as economic surrender. His rhetoric was fierce. "We are done being taken advantage of," he declared. "We're putting America first, no exceptions." Inside the White House, supporters cheered. In manufacturing towns hit hard by globalization, some Americans saw hope for a revival. But on the world stage, the reaction was swift and filled with dread. Global economists scrambled, diplomats bristled, CEOs from Silicon Valley to Berlin to Hanoi made urgent phone calls. In trading rooms from London to Hong Kong, red flashed across screens. The tariffs weren't just a policy shift, they were a seismic economic event. The foundation of decades of global trade cooperation suddenly looked shaky, and this was just the beginning. The market meltdown. Within hours of Trump's announcement, the global financial system began to wobble. Investors, analysts, and economic leaders had hoped for bold policy. But not like this. The ripple effect was almost immediate, and by the time the markets closed the next day, that ripple had turned into a financial landslide. In the UK, the FTSE 100, a benchmark index tracking the top-performing companies on the London Stock Exchange, nosedived 4.9%. It was the largest single-day drop since March 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic first sent shockwaves through global economies. Traders in London compared the atmosphere on the floor to that of a crisis. Flashing red tickers, panicked sell-offs, and a collective sense of disbelief. Across the Atlantic, American markets fared no better. The S&P 500, which represents the stock performance of 500 large companies in the US, plunged 4.4%. The Nasdaq, heavily weighted with tech giants, fell 3.7%, entering what's known as bear market territory. Down 20% from its recent high, a key signal of sustained investor pessimism. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was not immune either, dropping 2.7% as the opening bell set the tone for a brutal day of trading. It was clear early on which sector bore the brunt of the blow. Technology. Big names like Apple, Amazon, and Nvidia saw sharp declines. The reason? Tech companies rely on complex global supply chains. The new tariffs threatened to raise production costs, squeeze margins, and slow down innovation. For an industry built on speed, scale, and seamless international trade, Trump's tariffs weren't just inconvenient. They were existentially disruptive. The damage wasn't limited to stock tickers and spreadsheets. Investors Investor psychology had been rattled. In a matter of days, JP Morgan revised its global recession forecast, raising the probability from 40% to 60%. That's not just a small bump, that's a flashing red warning light from one of the world's most influential financial institutions. Economists warned that the reaction wasn't purely about tariffs themselves, but something even more dangerous: uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that makes companies halt spending, freeze hiring, and postpone decisions. The kind that makes investors pull their money from riskier assets and flood into safe havens. In the words of one Wall Street strategist, this isn't just economic fear, it's institutional paralysis. And that's when confidence collapses. From London to New York, from retail investors to billion-dollar hedge funds, the message was clear. Markets hate surprises, and this one had arrived like a thunderclap. The global retaliation begins. If the US tariffs were the opening shot, then the world's response was a counteroffensive, swift, sharp, and unmistakably serious. As global markets tumbled, the international community wasted no time in launching their own measures. The spirit of economic cooperation that had defined decades of globalization gave way to a new reality. A full-scale economic standoff was now underway. China, long the focal point of Trump's trade grievances, struck back with force. Within 24 hours of the US announcement, Beijing imposed a 34% tariff on American goods, a retaliatory strike that directly targeted sectors like agriculture, automotive, and electronics, industries that would hurt US exporters the most. But China didn't stop at tariffs. They also filed an official complaint with the World Trade Organization, calling the US measures a violation of international trade law. Their message was clear: this wasn't just a trade disagreement, it was a breach of the global rule book. Elsewhere in Asia, Vietnam, faced with a devastating 46% tariff, moved quickly to soften the blow. Hanoi reached out to Washington, offering to negotiate and even reduce its own tariffs to zero if a mutual agreement could be found. The Vietnamese government issued a public statement emphasizing their desire to avoid escalation and maintain strong economic ties with the US, but the clock was ticking, and their economy, so reliant on American demand, was now in a precarious position. Across the Atlantic, the European Union began preparing its own countermeasures. Senior officials in Brussels expressed deep concern over the unilateral nature of Trump's actions. Behind closed doors, discussions of coordinated EU tariffs were already underway. European leaders criticized the US for abandoning the diplomatic channels that had historically governed trade disputes and warned that a global economic spiral could be triggered if cooler heads didn't prevail. World leaders spoke out, not just in frustration, but with a rising sense of urgency. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called the US move destabilizing and counterproductive. Germany's Chancellor voiced concerns about economic fragmentation. The head of the International Monetary Fund urged restraint, warning that global growth is at risk if major economies resort to protectionism over collaboration. What had started as a single announcement from Mar-a-Lago was now a global chess match with high stakes and unpredictable moves. As one analyst put it, it's not just tit for tat anymore. It's a full-blown economic war, and there's no off-ramp in sight. The fallout at home. While headlines screamed of market crashes and global retaliation, the ripple effects were already hitting where it hurts most: American households. For the average consumer, the impact of the tariffs won't come with flashing tickers or breaking news banners. It will come at the checkout line. Prices on everyday goods are expected to climb. Electronics, furniture, clothing, and even groceries, much of which is imported, are all set to become more expensive. That $1,000 laptop could soon cost $1,100. A cart of groceries, up by 10%, maybe more. Economists warn that tariffs act like a hidden tax, not on foreign governments, but on American buyers who depend on a globally integrated supply chain. Retailers are caught in the middle of the storm. The White House reportedly urged them not to pass the costs on to customers, hoping to ease public backlash. But in private, CEOs and business owners say that's an unrealistic ask. Many operate on thin margins already, and absorbing the cost of steep import tariffs simply isn't sustainable. For smaller retailers, it could mean slashing staff, reducing inventory, or in the worst cases, closing doors altogether. Even the Federal Reserve is bracing for turbulence. Speaking at a press briefing, Fed Chair Jerome Powell said the tariffs were significantly larger than expected and warned of higher inflation and slower economic growth as likely consequences. Powell emphasized that while the job market had remained strong in March, the full impact of trade disruptions had yet to be felt. "We're well positioned to wait for greater clarity," he said, signaling that any major policy change, like adjusting interest rates, would be premature. That didn't stop President Trump from applying pressure. In a Truth Social post, he declared, "This is the perfect time to cut rates." It was a not-so-subtle nudge aimed at Powell, despite the Federal Reserve's independence from political influence. Trump sees rate cuts as a way to soften the blow to consumers and stimulate spending, but the Fed isn't moving yet. Back on Main Street, reactions have been mixed. Some Americans support the idea of standing up to foreign nations and reshaping trade deals, but others, already stretched thin by inflation and rising living costs, worry that the tariffs are another blow they can't afford. One shopper interviewed outside a Target store summed it up: "I get that it's about America first, but at this rate I won't be able to afford America." The promise of protecting American industry may end up costing American consumers the most, and if prices continue to climb while growth slows, this fallout could become the defining domestic issue of the year. Southeast Asia's crossroads. For the past 2 decades, countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand have ridden the wave of globalization to newfound prosperity. Their economic miracle has largely hinged on one critical factor: exports to the United States. From high-tech semiconductors and affordable textiles to flat-packed furniture and consumer electronics, these nations have become essential cogs in the global supply chain, feeding the insatiable demand of the American market. But Trump's sweeping tariffs have turned that once thriving trade lane into a high-risk gamble. Vietnam, which had emerged as a rising star in global manufacturing, is now facing a crippling 46% tariff on its exports. For an economy that sends more than a quarter of its goods to the US, this isn't just a hit, it's a potential economic shockwave. Cambodia, heavily reliant on its garment industry, has been slapped with an even steeper 49% tariff. These are not mere adjustments. They are devastating headwinds for countries whose growth has been built on low-cost, high-volume exports. The consequences are already looming. Factory owners are preparing for mass layoffs. Orders are being canceled. Production is slowing. In regions where employment depends almost entirely on manufacturing for export, even a short-term disruption can push families below the poverty line. For workers in these nations, this trade war isn't abstract policy. It's food on the table, rent due at month's end, and a future slipping out of reach. But beyond the immediate economic pain lies a larger geopolitical shift. Analysts warn that these steep tariffs could drive Southeast Asian nations closer to China, both economically and strategically. With the US erecting trade barriers, many of these countries may find more stable ground in deepening ties with Beijing, whose Belt and Road Initiative already promises infrastructure, trade agreements, and diplomatic partnership. What we are witnessing is more than just market reaction. It's a realignment of global alliances, powered not by treaties or treaties, but by spreadsheets, supply chains, and survival instincts. In the struggle between protectionism and prosperity, Southeast Asia is standing at a crossroads, and the path they choose next could define the region's future for generations to come. Inflation about to hit. For decades, American consumers have enjoyed something that felt almost like magic: cheap, high-quality goods from around the world. Whether it was a flat-screen TV from South Korea, a smartphone assembled in Vietnam, or a box of vanilla pods from Madagascar, global supply chains made it possible to stock shelves at prices that felt too good to question. This system, seamless, efficient, invisible, was the quiet engine of modern consumer life. But that engine just hit a wall. The introduction of sweeping tariffs threatens to undo years of deflationary pressure, which had helped keep prices low for everything from electronics and clothing to furniture and food. Now, even everyday essentials are caught in the crossfire. Take Madagascar vanilla, a tiny but telling example. It's a vital ingredient in everything from ice cream to baked goods, and now it faces double-digit import tariffs. That cost won't be absorbed by governments or corporations. It will trickle down to consumers consumers, $1 at a time. Retailers already navigating inflationary trends from the post-pandemic recovery are finding themselves boxed in. Margins are tight, demand is uncertain, and absorbing the new import costs just isn't feasible. Instead, prices will rise, not because retailers are greedy, but because they have no choice. And while large corporations may find ways to soften the blow in the short term, small businesses are far more vulnerable with limited room to maneuver. The biggest issue? Time. Supply chains. The vast, intricate web of manufacturing, shipping, warehousing, and delivery that fuels global commerce can't be rerouted overnight. Finding new suppliers, securing new trade deals, reworking logistics, and meeting regulatory standards is a process that can take months, if not years. In the meantime, the tariffs are active, the clock is ticking, and all of this points to one harsh truth: the era of cheap is ending. As one economist put it, you can't protect the house without raising the rent, and someone always pays. For now, that someone appears to be the average consumer, and unless there's a major policy reversal or a sudden diplomatic breakthrough, inflation may not just return, but it may become the new normal. What happens next? With the world rattled and economic lines redrawn, a single question now hangs in the air. Where do we go from here? The planet stands at a crossroads. One path leads to adaptation, a painful, chaotic adjustment to a new normal of tariffs, trade blocs, and nationalistic economics. The other leads to confrontation, a deepening global trade war that risks plunging markets and nations into prolonged economic turmoil. At this point, either scenario feels equally plausible. If confidence continues to slide, the prospect of a global recession grows ever more likely. We've already seen markets react with panic, but the true danger lies in what comes next. Reduced spending, slower hiring, frozen investment, and a ripple effect that could stretch from Wall Street to the most remote supply chain outposts in Southeast Asia. When businesses and consumers stop believing the system is stable, the system stops working. Another possibility is the rise of rapid trade realignment, particularly in Asia. As the US walls itself off with tariffs, nations like Vietnam, Cambodia, and even longtime Western allies may seek deeper ties with China, who now presents itself as a more consistent, cooperative economic partner. This could mark the birth of new coalitions, regional alliances that exclude the United States, upending decades of US-led globalization. Domestically, the fallout could be just as fierce. If inflation keeps climbing while economic growth slows, Americans may start feeling betrayed by the very policies meant to protect them. Rising grocery bills, shrinking paychecks, and shuttered small businesses could erode public support. And in an election year, economic anxiety has the power to shift the political winds fast. Yet through it all, one voice remains defiantly unchanged: President Trump. In a flurry of posts and press statements, he has doubled down, stating, "My policies will never change." He believes this is the cost of sovereignty, that in the long run, America will come out stronger, leaner, more self-reliant. But around the world, patience is wearing thin. Allies feel abandoned, competitors feel provoked, and neutral nations, caught in the middle, are being forced to choose sides in an economic war no one wanted.